In this video, I'm going to be going through some engineering innovations. They're not in any particular order, well, they're based on the order I teach year 11s, but we're just going to be having a look at a whole bunch of different things in sort of a bit of a random order. So the first thing is bronze. So bronze is really important as a material because it can be cast into lots of interesting shapes. After bronze, we have iron. So iron is much... it can be much stronger than bronze, and so it's interesting that sometimes weapons were still made out of bronze, but armor was maybe made out of iron because bronze could be harder, so it could be sharper. But these days, iron or iron alloys like steel are the most commonly used engineering material. Probably the second most commonly used engineering material, or maybe even more common than steel, is concrete. And so concrete was used by the ancient Romans to build things like the Parthenon in Rome. It's got this big concrete dome arch. The thing is, people actually forgot how to make concrete for about 1,000 years. But now it's used lots and lots for almost all construction uses concrete. Aluminium is an interesting metal in that it's very light and it doesn't corrode, but when aluminium was first developed, it was really expensive because it used lots and lots of electricity to produce. And there's stories that aluminium was worth more than gold. Nowadays, it's important not to throw away aluminium cans because it takes 20 times the energy to produce a new aluminium can, or you could recycle 20 cans for the amount of energy it takes to produce one new can. Bakelite is a famous plastic that was used for things like, it wasn't really used until after at least World War I in widespread use. But the advantage was that rather than having to make a TV cabinet, or probably more accurately, a radio cabinet out of timber, which would take a lot of labor to produce, instead you could make a cabinet or a housing for the radio very cheaply out of bakelite, out of plastic, and you could make it in a lot of bright colors as well as making it out of interesting shapes. These days, the most commonly used plastics are polyethylene. Polyethylene is it has two numbers, both number 2 and number 4 are both polyethylene. And polypropylene is interesting because it has things like, it can be bent. So things like lunch boxes that have a living hinge are made out of, or Tic Tac boxes are made out of polypropylene. The steam pump was originally first used to pump out water out of mines, but eventually it was used as the basis of steam engines. The Bessemer process is how we first were able to make widespread use of steel, was after the Bessemer process. So steel does go back to Roman times, but steel as we know it now is really after the Bessemer process. Thomas Edison developed the first electric power plant. Not this exact picture, I just took something that looked close enough. But the first power plants were developed by Edison, and it was in London, and then there was one in upstate New York, so at the Niagara Falls. The wheel is a very old technology. Anyone who's ever had to move a fridge, help someone move out of their apartment, will know how valuable a trolley with wheels is, that it drastically improves or reduces the amount of work that it takes to do something. It's a pretty important innovation. Cast iron is one of the things that triggered the first industrial revolution, and because suddenly things that used to take a blacksmith a week to do, Abraham Darby could produce 16 of in a day. So massive improvement in his production methods thanks to cast iron. The Benz patent motor wagon is the first car, and the first long distance drive was done by Carl Benz's wife Bertha. And along that drive, she developed several new technologies. She added an extra gear. She put in brake linings and a few other innovations. The first mass-produced car was the Model T Ford. 15 million of them were produced, and this was also associated with what we call the production line. The Volkswagen Beetle, which was developed by Porsche during the Nazi regime, there were 21 million of these produced, and for a long time they were the the most produced car in the world. Now famous for punch buggies. The Citroen DS19 had really good ride comfort because of disc brakes and better suspension. The prosthetic leg, so we learn about different kinds of prosthesis, and so these are things like fake legs, and now these days robotic arms. So people who lose an arm, they replace it with a prosthetic. The oldest that we're aware of is 2,300 years old. There are probably legs or prosthetic legs that are older, but this one is made out of brass, so where the wooden ones would have rotted away. There might have been other brass ones. This is just the oldest one we've found. The X-ray allows us to see what's happening inside people's bodies, to help us to see things like broken bones, and with things like barium that you can swallow, you can find blockages. Radiation therapy is a way of treating cancer. Stainless steel is as strong as steel, or often stronger than steel, than mild steel, but it doesn't rust. The biggest problem with steel is rust. The Kroll process helped us to produce titanium, and titanium is used in this, as we can see, is a skull bone for someone who's had a serious fracture. But it can also be used in architecture. I often use the picture of the Guggenheim in Bilbao, which is a famous museum that's made out of titanium. Hip replacements allow people to walk after having a serious injury in their leg. It not only allows them to be more mobile, to go back to work, but also drastically reduces the amount of pain. Pacemakers make sure that your heart beats at the right rhythm, so that you don't, so that your heart works normally. The Sip and Puff Typewriter is a way for people who are paralyzed or quadriplegics to be able to type a letter, and that's really important, so that way they can communicate with people when they're not in the room. CT scans or CAT scans allow us to see what's going on inside people's brains, particularly things like stroke. They help us to see that if people are having a stroke, we can operate. Cochlear implants allow deaf people to hear. Artificial hearts help people who have heart defects so that they can pump blood through their body and not die. Nowadays, we have an advantage on MRI scans. We have fMRI scans, which can allow us to monitor brain activity. And this allows us to do a whole lot of interesting research in psychology and better understand how the brain works. The oldest temple that we're aware of, the oldest structure that we've really found, is Göbekli Tepe. It's 12,000 years old. It's a 6-meter tall temple. So, I mean, that's 2 stories tall. And it happens to be found around about the place where wheat was first domesticated. This was only found relatively recently, and it's what we kind of consider it to be the first sign of civilization. So civilization being where societies can pool their resources so that not everyone is focused on survival, on food. The Great Pyramid of Giza was the tallest building for thousands of years. It's 145 or 47 meters tall. The Romans used arches in their bridges, and in this case, this bridge is for carrying water, so that so the Romans could set up cities where there wasn't necessarily a river. Arches are really strong in compression. The Roman Colosseum could hold 80,000 spectators, which is as the same amount as the MCG, and is still one of the world's largest stadiums, or stadia is the plural of stadium. The Lincoln Cathedral was the tallest building for a long time. It was the first building taller than the pyramids. The thing is, it got damaged, and so people weren't really sure, but now we like to think that it probably was taller than the pyramids. The first suspension bridge, like a chain suspension bridge, not quite the same as what we consider when we think about modern suspension bridges like the Brooklyn Bridge, but very long bridges, is the Chakzam Bridge, which is in Tibet, and it's 137 meters long. The Iron Bridge was the first bridge made from cast iron, so it's a really significant bridge in structural engineering history. The Suez Canal was famous really recently because the Ever Given got stuck, and that it slowed down international transport because it's a hugely important waterway and really important for shipping. The Metropolitan Railway, or the Tube, is the first subway. The Eiffel Tower was the tallest building in the world for 40 years. It's 300 meters tall, and I think it's the tallest building standing that was taller than the pyramids. It's slightly smaller than Uluru, but my mother was telling me today. The fourth bridge is a cantilever bridge, and it was the longest bridge at the time. It's 520 meters long, which is longer than the Sydney Harbour Bridge, but it was built 30 years beforehand. It's in England. The Empire State Building was the tallest building in the world. It is taller than the Eiffel Tower. It's 381 meters tall. There was a bit of a race in New York to build big skyscrapers until the Great Depression, and when the Great Depression hit, that really slowed down skyscrapers. It's now after the fall of the Twin Towers, it is now the tallest building. Oh, no, it's no longer the tallest building because I can't remember what they call the tower they put up at the World Trade Center, but that is now taller, I think. The Sydney Harbour Bridge is the longest bridge in Australia. It has the longest single span of any bridge. It's 500 metres from end to end. The Golden Gate Bridge is 1.2 kilometres long, and it was the longest bridge for a very long time. They say it's the most famous bridge in the world. The Hoover Dam is a massive engineering project and the largest engineering project in the world at its time. The Snowy Mountain Scheme is the largest engineering project in Australia. Some people say that the NBN was a bigger engineering project, maybe in terms of dollars, and because it's more recent. But the Snowy Mountain Scheme is a very big engineering project worth knowing as an Australian good piece of trivia. The CN Tower was the tallest building when I went and saw it. It's 550 meters tall, but now the things like the Burj Khalifa are taller. It's in Canada. You might know it from the Drake album where he's sitting on it, and that Drake is shown as being like 15 meters tall. The Sydney Opera House is it's a famous concrete structure with tiles. It's a famous international icon. The largest stadium in the world is in North Korea. I don't know how many people it holds, but it holds a lot. The Akashi Kaiko Bridge joins Tokyo and Kobe. It is the longest bridge in the world, or at least it was when I made these slides. The Three Gorges Dam, I think, is like the largest engineering project in human history so far. The Burj Khalifa is the tallest building in the world now. It's so tall that it actually produces a lot of challenges in how you can pump concrete up that high. The largest building in the world is the New Century Global Center. Prior to that, the Pentagon was the largest building in the world. It's really big. I sometimes talk to my senior students about when I visited the Pentagon. It's not all that impressive to look at from the ground. It's just a big grey building. The Boeing manufacture location somewhere in Seattle, it was really big as well because it needs to be able to build 747s and Dubai Airport is also really big. The Grand Canal in China, it's a canal like the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal, which we'll see, but it's much older, and it joins the Yangtze River to the Yellow River. Stephenson's rocket is kind of considered as the first steam train, or certainly the first, it was an influential, that's what we're going to go with, an influential steam train. The Velocipede is an early bike. We have here Carl Dreis Laufmachine, which is probably what we can see here because that doesn't have pedals. It's hard to say specifically when the first bike, what we'd consider a modern bike, but by 1880 we really started to have things like, by 1888 we had pneumatic tires thanks to Dunlop, and that really kicked off a big innovation in much lighter and much easier to ride bicycles. The petrol engine was developed in 1876. The Panama Canal these days, I think, is the most important, the most heavily trafficked waterway in the world. It's a really, the entire canal is an amazing engineering feat. Took 3 different attempts to build it. The French tried to build it, the Americans tried to build it, and they gave up, and then they came back later and they built it the third time round. The longest tunnel in the world is not like the English Channel. This is both older and longer than the English Channel, and which is the Seikan Tunnel, which joins the 2 main islands of Japan. Balloon flight is the first time that humans could really control flight in any meaningful way, and that was developed by 2 French brothers, the Montgolfier brothers, Golfier. I always get the L wrong. Carbon fiber is a lot older than people think, but it really only saw use in the 1990s, widespread use. The first heavier than air aircraft is, some people dispute this, but generally it's recognized as the Wright brothers as being the first people to not only achieve flight, but also they were the first people to develop mass-produced planes. A lot of interesting technology, including the things like their use of aluminium engines. We have the first transatlantic flight taking place 16 years later. So it's very interesting how quickly flight took off, and how quickly... I don't have the moon landing, but the moon landing was only 66 years later. Sydney Airport is the oldest civilian airport. I think there's an older airport in Germany, in like Hamburg, but it was a military airport. The Gloster Meteor was the first jet aircraft. There was the German Hinker 178 or something like that. Was arguably predates the Gloster Meteor, but it was never used in any widespread application. It wasn't used in battle, whereas the Gloster Meteor was. The first helicopter is, and this is the first field helicopter. There might have been people who produced something first, but this was the first mass-produced and used in any real application, is the FA-223 Drache. Drache meaning is German for dragon. The first supersonic air flight was the Bell X-1, piloted by Chuck Yeager. The first time a human went into space was Yuri Gagarin in 1961. The Boeing 747 was the largest passenger plane for 30 years, and then COVID came along and it was already on the way out, but these days there's not enough people flying that these older aircraft could be justified. So they've now mostly, in Australia, they've been decommissioned. The International Space Station is the most expensive thing ever built. The A380 was when it was developed in 2015, and it really only had they discontinued it 15 years later. Just because people don't really want large passenger aircraft these days. Australia still uses them, but we'll be able to use the ones that have been built for some time. But there's not really enough demand for future ones because most people want smaller, more fuel-efficient aircraft. That's the focus these days. Morse code is the first time that people could send very fast communication. The French did have things like the Sharp semaphore network, but the Morse code came along very quickly afterwards, and it allowed people to be able to send signals, send messages to people great distance away, much faster than they could send a letter on a horse. The Transatlantic Telegraph was, there were several attempts to produce the Transatlantic Telegraph, and that was so that people could send messages from the United States to Europe. The telephone allowed people to use voice communication rather than having to write things down and have an operator send it over public networks. It didn't take off all that quickly, but eventually it's now the foundational technology that we use every day in our mobile phones. The radio telegraph was a way of sending at first Morse code and then later audio signals, like so voice or music, without the need for wires. They say that everyone who survived on the Titanic survived because of the radio telegraph, because ships would use radio to send out distress signals. The transistor is the basis of modern computing, and that was developed by AT&T and Bell Labs. Sputnik was the first artificial satellite, and it didn't really do, well, I don't want to say it didn't do that much, but it sent a static signal. These days, satellites are very important for modern telecommunications, so that everything from television to things like Elon Musk's Starlink, which provides the internet for people who live in remote locations. Email is much older than people think. It was developed by the US military. Laser printing, I think, is one of the most innovative technologies in human history. The idea that it would be a pretty crazy thing for someone to come up with. It really was something that was more of an invention than most things that we think of as inventions. Optical fiber allows us to send information really fast. Really quickly is probably the better way of saying that. HTML is the basis for the World Wide Web, so what we can consider the modern internet. That's all specified under the standard of HTML, which is specified by W3, the W3 Corporation. Whoops. Wi-Fi was, I think this is the last one. Wi-Fi was developed by the CSIRO, which is an Australian organisation, and it paid for a lot of scientific research. So it's now the basis of it. I mean, it came about from the time it was developed to the time it was in every single laptop was very, very quick. So there you go. That's 80 engineering innovations.